Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Murder at the Library. I'm Rebecca Vanook, Executive Director of Library Reads. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for another installment of this Murder at the Library book club, brought to you by Sourcebooks and Baker and Taylor. Tonight, we're also streaming the event live on Facebook. So welcome to those of you who are visiting with us on Facebook. We do have someone that's paying attention to the chat there, so do feel free to go ahead and use that tonight. So I am thrilled to be here tonight with best-selling author Greer McAllister, who's going to be discussing her latest novel, The Arctic Fury. Before we begin the discussion tonight, I have a few housekeeping items just to make sure everybody's aware of. There's going to be a few chances tonight to win prizes throughout the event. All you have to do is participate in one of the two trivia polls that we're going to have, or ask a question for us for Greer, and you'll be entered to win a mystery book bundle from Sourcebooks. Now, don't worry, I will call out when there's something you're supposed to be participating in, so you'll know. And again, if you're watching us through Facebook, go ahead and use the comments there. We're going to have our moderator enter the questions in the comments there, and you can put your answers there as well, and she'll be monitoring that. So if you have questions for Greer and you're attending via Zoom, please use the Q&A box that's going to be at the bottom of your screen instead of the side chat box. Now, we absolutely want you to use that side chat box. It's a fun way for everybody to kind of connect with everybody that's watching, say hi to each other, where you're from, what's going on. But if you have a specific question you want us to try and ask when we get near the end, take it over to the Q&A box instead, just so we have one place where everything's kind of solid and I'll know that the question is there. So thanks very much for that. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of background on our friend Greer. So raised in the Midwest, Greer McAllister earned her MFA in creative writing from American University. Her debut novel, The Magician's Lie, was a USA Today bestseller, an Indie Next pick, and a Target Book Club selection. Her novels Girl in Disguise and Woman 99 were inspired by pioneering 19th century private detectives Kate Warren and fearless journalist Nellie Bly, respectively. Her newest book, The Arctic Fury, was named an Indie Next and a December 2020 Library Reads pick, an Amazon Best Book of the Month, and spotlighted new release at Pop Sugar, Libro.fm, and Goodreads. Greer is a regular contributor to Writer Unboxed and the Chicago Review of Books, and she lives with her family in Washington, D.C. Hi, Greer. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Rebecca. It is fabulous to be here.
Yay. So let's get right into talking about your book, okay? So, actually, let's talk a little bit background-wise about all of your books, because female empowerment, right? That is a common thread amongst all four of your books. So I'd like to know, did you grow up with strong female role models? Did your parents make it a goal to empower you from a young age? Tell us how you started to write fascinating stories featuring inspirational women.
It's a great question. I love it. Yes, I was very supported in just my identity and comfort and encouraged growing up. I think my mom is probably on tonight. Hi, Mom. So my mother, my grandmothers on both sides, great grandmothers, lots of great family stories about women striking out and being bold and doing what women needed to do. So I hear sometimes stories from people who are sort of writing as a reaction to not being empowered in childhood and beyond, but I never had that. I've been very, very lucky. My parents always really encouraged me, and there was never any hint of, oh, you can't do that because you're a girl. Oh, you can't do that because you're a woman. That's just for boys. That's just for men. That was never really an issue in my family. And that is how I learned that it didn't have to be an issue out in the world, which is absolutely wonderful. And one of our family friends loves to tell the story of when I was in, I think it was fourth grade, I was in a college prep program, which is a little bit, young for college prep. But it was really about giving kids better self-esteem and education. And we learned a lot of speeches, and they were always very, self-esteem reinforcing power kinds of speeches. And there was a line in one of my speeches where I said, "No man will dominate me." Uh, and so
I love it. I love it.
I think even at my wedding, he told that story. Which is very appropriate at a wedding. But my husband's okay with it. So no man does dominate me. And certainly in my books, historical women have had more obstacles to overcome. But I think there's a sense for people, especially if they don't read a lot of historical fiction, there's a sense of looking at the past and saying, oh, women then were different from women now. You know, they just believed that a woman's place was in the home and they never tried to break out of that. And of course, that's true in the broader society that women's place was in the home. But you can bet your bottom dollar that there were some women who didn't believe that, who didn't want to do that, and who didn't do that. And so those are sort of the women that I'm drawing on from the past. And there are women and men in my books who don't believe that women can do anything. But there are women in my books who do believe that. So I've been able to pull so many of these great stories. Some of my books are more based on real life historical figures than others, but in all of them, you'll see the pattern, whether they're drawing on Kate Warren, the first female Pinkerton detective, or just women who are sort of drawn as types of women from history. There are women who believe in themselves and go ahead and take the reins and don't wait for somebody else to tell them what they can and can't do.
Got it. Got it. So that's very interesting that you sort of mentioned, not everybody historically, right, has felt that way, that women should be empowered. And so I love that you're able to take these historical settings and some real people and kind of, put them in there for today's readers to sort of, pluck some of that out. So along that theme, all of your books are very female centric, but they usually revolve around one strong female protagonist. So this one's a little different, though, the Arctic Fury. You've got this whole band of women that are like, it's not just one. So interestingly enough, that sort of makes this a very timely and relevant story. Right now we've got the whole Me Too movement, people speaking up on stuff. More than ever, we have, the most number of women in elected government positions than ever before. So it's kind of like very timely that we're seeing, here's this historical fiction that could have been like, oh, gentle, nice, whatever, women in the background. I should have an explorer. It should be a man, and women are just kind of the set dressing. And instead, well, no, we've got this strong group of women. So did you kind of feel like the present sort of impresses what you're writing about from the past? Are current events and movements like the impetus for books like The Arctic Fury? Tell us a little bit about that.
In my case, not intentionally. I don't ever look at what's going on in the world and then go back and find the parallel in history for historical fiction. But pretty much certainly the last two books that I've written, I've been writing the books and then found parallels
That's really cool.
In the current situation. So I think that, it's, lost my train of thought. So so particularly in this the kernel of this book, where it really came from, was just this idea of, okay, what if women had gone, and this period of Arctic exploration was a very male undertaking. The British sent hundreds, thousands of men looking for the Northwest Passage, ships full of men going up rivers, men in canoes. And there wasn't the female tradition there. And I'd read some fabulous books about people searching for the Lost Franklin expedition. And it isn't a female story, but the more that I researched the period, there were women at the time in the 1840s and 1850s doing things that we would think of as very modern today. There were women who were battlefield nurses, and they were, they were on the Oregon Trail and the California Trail, leaving their entire lives behind and helping their families cross an entire continent to find a new life in a completely strange place. And so you can't tell me that women did not have a pioneering spirit.
Right.
In these days. So I started sort of picking and choosing, and I call it sort of my all-female supergroup, pulling together these types of women. And in some cases, women that were very much influenced by specific historical figures of the time, and sort of pulled them together and said, well, what if they had been able to do this? And then discovered along the way, while I was researching, Lady Jane Franklin, who was the wife of the Lost Franklin expedition's leader, who did fund expeditions and send people looking for her husband. And she was a real pistol. Also, she did all sorts of things and sailed up the Nile and met with Bedouins and Janissaries and climbed mountains in Tasmania and all sorts of stuff. So she's in the book too. And it didn't feel like that much of a reach to say, well, she had sent wave after wave of men looking for her husband and none of them had succeeded. So what if she sent women instead?
I love it. I love it. That's a really good reimagining. So that's a really good, interesting look at your characters. Switch it over a little bit. So I think that a lot of readers, after reading this, have thought to themselves, this backdrop of the Arctic, it's almost like another character, right? And you have a really good gift for this sort of crafting a place as being so important that it's more a character than it is a setting. So was that kind of your goal, was to really bring the Arctic forward like that? And how do you think that creating such vivid imagery about time and place adds to a story? Because you could have sort of been like, no, I'm going to concentrate just on the women here. We're just going to talk about them. They happen to be in the Arctic. And yes, it's important because that's how they all fit together. But instead, you've really made the Arctic like, the you are there kind of feel. How does that sort of, how do you feel that adds to the story?
I think it's what inspired me in the first place. And I think it's something that really brings the reader in, because it's a very unusual setting for historical fiction. I love me some World War II historical fiction, but I've seen the European theater, I've seen the home front, I've seen stories of women doing a set number of things. But the idea of an action adventure historical novel was what really appealed to me. So I wanted that setting to come alive for the reader. And I really feel like that's one of the most amazing things about historical fiction, this book and my other books as well. I'm trying to back there. And the historical fiction that I read also, I want to be swept away. I want to disappear into this world. And with historical fiction, it's not a place that you as a reader could just stand up and walk and go visit. It's a place in the past. So I have to show it to you in as much detail as it takes to make it come alive. And it's not, it's not a travelogue. If you wanted to, read about Arctic exploration in painstaking detail, you can always read the actual journals of actual Arctic explorers. But if you want to disappear into that world, but also have this narrative, this powerful narrative that brings you along with the mystery, right? Because it's who died and why and what happened. Marrying that setting and that mystery and those characters, and making it come alive, not just through visuals, but through what does it smell like? What does it feel like? If the side of your head is wet and you go out into, sub-freezing temperatures, what happens to the side of your head? Spoiler alert, nothing good. So I really wanted, and I was walking out of my house like in short sleeves in January going, okay, how does this feel? How does it feel after a minute? How does it feel after 5 minutes? Because I really do want it to come alive. And then it's particularly with the Arctic, because very few of us have been in this environment, it was all the more important.
I was just going to say that, right? That's, this is not something that somebody could be like, oh yeah, I've been there. Shoot, that's exactly what it's like. Like, no, we're counting on you, the author, to really tell us what it's like, because chances of us ever being there are slim to none. And not only that, but back when you didn't have, your Land's End parka and your Columbia boots and all that kind of stuff, we need to know what was it really like. So you really did a great job sort of, with that exposition on that, and people have really sort of, they connect with that. So that's really awesome. So speaking of connecting and all of that, it's obvious from your books that this is not just some story that you made in your head and you're just going to put in details that you wanted to, and this is what you think might have happened. It is very clear that you do a lot of really deep research in your books, which is awesome. And so I know that the bulk of our audience tonight is library folks, and we always like to know about research and how you did it. So tell us a little bit about your research for this novel. What's your process like? Where did you go? What did you do? Find anything exciting? So tell us a little bit about how you dove into, do you dive in, get it all set, and then start writing? Do you research as you go along? What's your research process? We always love to hear about that.
I have an ideal research process, and then I have how I did this. So The Magician's Lie took me 5 years because I didn't really know how to write historical fiction, and I was writing, and then I would stop and be like, I need a hat in this piece, so I'm going to go read about hats for 3 hours and then come back. And during the 3 hours that you're reading about hats, you're not writing anything. It took me a while to figure that out. So for both Girl in Disguise and Woman 99, I had a very set process of read, dig into everything. For Girl in Disguise, I went to the Library of Congress because that's where the Pinkerton archives are, and I read about Kate Warne. And so I love to gather as much as research as I can up front, then stop researching and write a draft, and then go back and research some more and get down to the details of like, okay, if somebody's in 1856 Chicago and they start on Adams and they walk 6 blocks and turn right, what street are they on? So I leave that sort of stuff for the end, but I need more of it up front so that I can shape the story correctly. But for the Arctic Fury, I kind of underestimated how much research I was going to need to do. And so I ended up in the imperfect position of reading while I was writing. And the good news is about, all of this Arctic stuff is that people were writing things down. So I had, for a change, more than I needed. Of detail and power, and you know exactly what somebody sees if they stand in a specific place and they look out. So some of it was library books, some of it was books that I just had to have so I could do things like this and put all the post-it notes. So this is Sir John Franklin's Erebus and Terror expedition. And I'm not writing about the actual Franklin expedition. I'm writing about people looking for it, but there's so many details that I could use. And then there's always the process of winnowing it down and saying, okay, well, what details are going to be the most powerful and bring you into the story without making you feel like you're reading a list. And then also with the Arctic, it is so different depending on the time of year that you're there. Okay. So I had to do like a big timeline and a calendar, like, okay, well, if they're on the bay you can't be on the bay in February, you can't be on the bay in March, you might be on the bay in April, but then you have to, it's a lot, ... So I really do, I draw heavily on internet sources, I draw heavily on library sources, and just sort of dig in and make a note of everything and then decide, do I need it? Can I get by without it? And I sometimes need help. Like I have a scene in The Magician's Lie where it's the Biltmore estate in North Carolina and it's their first Christmas and there's this big Christmas dinner. And I wrote it. And then my agent said, it feels like you could get a little bit deeper into this kind of detail because people love like the plates of food and all that stuff. So it was like a 2-page scene. And then I rewrote it to be like a 10-page scene. And then she's like, no, that's too much. I'm like, oh, okay. Make it back down to 5 pages. So a lot of times I have to do it before I know whether it's right or not. And I need somebody to help me figure out whether it's right or not. So the research is all me. That's all gathering, but the writing, I need to start, I start to need other thoughts and other opinions. And I have trusted readers who help me figure that stuff out.
Awesome. Kind of a tangent on this, just for my own curiosity, was there anything while you were researching this that you thought, oh my gosh, I have to get that detail into the book, like this is really cool? Or was there anything that you're like, oh, I was going to put in this, and then in your research discovered that wasn't correct? Like you just said, right? You couldn't be on the bay in February or in January. Like, did you have anything that your research showed you, whoops, gotta walk that back a little bit and fix it, or something that you were like, oh, gotta get in? Is there anything that stood out to you?
I had to change the route that they took because
Oh, okay. See,
most of the British ships sailed in through Baffin Bay in the far north, and I wanted my people to come up from the south, and so I had to keep sort of cobbling together how do you get through the Great Lakes and how do you get over, and then those sorts of details. But the stuff that I found that I really had to include was all about Lady Jane Franklin. So she sends letters with this expedition, which is actually something that she did in real life. When she sent an expedition in search of her husband, she would give them letters to deliver to her husband if they should find him. Um,
okay.
and so I had sort of wanted to write letters in there. And when I found out she actually did write letters, I'm like, oh yeah, Jane, let's do this thing. So those had to get in there. And then there's a list in the very first scene where she meets Virginia. She sort of lists off all of these things that she's done. And she did do all of those things.
Oh,
She
got it.
sailed up the Nile and she went to Malta, and that whole list is 100% Jane Franklin.
Very cool. Well, we are going to talk a little bit more about Jane Franklin in a minute because that's one of our questions from our participating libraries. But first, let's take a little trivia break here. So, as I said, everyone, I will let you know when it's time to participate. Here we go. So we are going to play a little game called the Arctic Fast and Furious. Haha, get it? I know, so clever, so clever. So for all of you explorers, travelers, adventurers, these questions are for you. We're going to go a little bit Nat Geo tonight because they're all going to be questions about the Arctic. So these are going to be true or false questions. We're going to put them up on screen in just a minute in a row. That's the fast part of Fast and Furious. So we're going to have these questions up for just about 20 seconds, and then the answers will be posted in the chat. So there's the first one up right now. Arctic is home to many types of seabirds, but no penguins, true or false? So get on that one, and then we'll have the comments go along. We'll have the answer in the comments, and then we'll put up the next couple of questions right in a row like this. And remember, every time that you participate, or if you've asked a question, you're going to be entered in to win a mystery prize pack. So there's another question for you. And while you're looking at those questions, Greer, I just want to know, while people are sort of doing that, what do you like to read yourself? I know you write historical fiction, so do you also like to read it? Or are you kind of like, no, I like zombie books? Tell us a little bit about that.
I haven't read any zombie books lately, but now I'm thinking about it. So I thought I would pull up my Overdrive screen.
Very cool, very cool.
For my library friends out there. So when I was thinking about this question, I'm like, I do love historical fiction. I'm about to start reading The Yellow Wife by Sidiqua Johnson. I'm reading The Paragon Hotel by Lindsay Fay. And then I was thinking, like, I like romance sometimes, I like historical fiction sometimes, I like fantasy sometimes. And I was thinking, oh, the one thing that I almost never read is sci-fi. And then I realized, no, I'm reading sci-fi right now. I'm reading one of Martha Wells' Murderbot novella.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't know Murderbot, you must get to know Murderbot. Murderbot is awesome. And then audiobooks also I like to listen to. So I'm listening to Melissa Albert's Tales from the Hinterland. So if you've read or heard of her books, The Hazelwood and The Night Country, one of the characters in those books writes a famous book of fairy tales. And so for her third book, Melissa has actually written the book of fairy tales. They're
cool.
very dark, some romantic, some, disturbing types of fairy tales. And on an audiobook, it's great because I can sort of listen to one and then stop, and I don't listen to it right before bedtime because I'm pretty sure that I would have nightmares about, people cutting feet off and things like that, because it's that kind of fairy tale. It's like a Grimm's fairy tale kind of thing, but it's very interesting about women's roles in classic fairy tales and those sorts of things. So
Cool.
I read a little bit of everything whenever I get the chance.
That is very cool. Awesome. I love it. All right. So we've got our, I see in the chat here that Tiffany from Sourcebooks has been giving us the answers. So how did everybody do? We had, what was it? 2 truths and a false, two truths and a lie. Is that the game? So the Arctic is home to many seabirds, but no penguins. That is true. The Arctic Ocean the countries of Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia make up the Arctic. That is false. Alaska and Canada are also part of it. And the Arctic Ocean is the smallest of the Earth's 5 major oceans. That is true. So hopefully you all had fun with that trivia. We'll have another round of trivia in maybe about 10 minutes or so. But let's get back to questions. All right. So right before we did trivia, you started telling us a little bit about Lady Jane Franklin. And that is a question that has come to us from Perry Public Library in Iowa, one of our participating libraries tonight. They would like to know, how did you find out about the true story of Lady Jane Franklin that was the basis for this? Did you stumble across her story in a book? Did you get an idea like, oh, I want to set my next thing in the Arctic, let's do some research, hey, this woman is really cool? Or tell us how you came across this true story of Lady Jane.
I tend to stumble. That seems to be that seems to be how most of these things show up.
I love it.
But in this case, I remember distinctly that when I found out about the Lost Franklin expedition initially, it was in graduate school because I was reading a short story by Margaret Atwood, who is one of my favorite writers of all time. And she is Canadian, and the Franklin expedition, I believe, is much better known as a story in Canada than it is in the US, just because they were searching for the ships for such a long time in Canada. I think they were finally found in 2014 and 2016. So that's a lot of searching. They were lost in the 1840s. So the Lost Franklin expedition has been sort of this looming thing for a long time. What happened to them? Where did they go? Did they eat each other? You know, what happened? And there was a story that Margaret Atwood wrote about the Franklin expedition that centered on what at that time was a recent revelation that, when these ships went out, they could be gone for years because they would sail into the Arctic. The water would freeze over, so they would overwinter. They would just sort of let the ships get trapped in the ice. Not like you have an option to not let the ship get trapped in the ice, but the ships would get trapped in the ice, and then they would just stay there all winter and wait for the ship to get out of the ice and then sail a little farther and then get frozen in again. So they took several years worth of tinned food with them, but they had cut some corners and given that contract to the lowest bidder, and the company that sealed up their food did it incorrectly and with lead. And so at that time, it was a major sort of breakthrough revelation that the Franklin expedition, they might have all died of lead poisoning because that was the only food that they had to eat. And if you have the choice between some funky smelling food and no food at all, you go with the funky smelling food. So so it was a great short story. Margaret Atwood always does this stuff justice, and that was my first experience with the Franklin expedition. And then I read a fabulous book also by Andrea Barrett called The Voyage of the Narwhal, which is it is about somebody who goes in search of an American who goes in search of the Lost Franklin expedition. And it has female characters, but the female characters' roles are very circumscribed to, wait for the guy to come home. And so that was sort of the first kernel that made me think, oh, well, what if we sort of borrowed some of that story for the women of the time? And then I've been reading a lot of Lady Jane specific stuff. There's this great book, Lady Franklin's Revenge. She was friends with Charles Dickens. He was big in her story also, and had some role in that. So there's so much out there. And somebody even sent me recently a video of. You can see a video of the shipwreck now. I can't remember if it's the Erebus or the Terror, but it's one of them that they actually, sort of like they do with the Titanic, you take the camera down and sort of go through all of these rooms.
And that's always very cool, right? To sort of like see that stuff. Yeah. Very cool. All right. Well, good. Thank you. And I'm sure that our friends at Perry Public Library are excited to know more about that. So thanks.
And I'm from Iowa, so my Iowa library represent. Thank you.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So we have time here for our next set of trivia questions. So our friends over at Sourcebooks are going to get those ready to put them up on the screen. So we've got 3 more fast and furious true and false questions. And while we are looking at those trivia questions, we're going to go and take a look at the Q&A that you guys have all been oh so helpfully filling out for us there in that box. We have I'm excited to see, yes, keeping it's like reading, listening. So we have a lot of questions from folks that are sort of similar. So I'm going to try and put some of those together for you. But in the meanwhile, everybody should take a look at those poll questions, and we'll get those up for everyone. And go ahead. This will be your kind of last chance to ask some questions before we start skimming through them and answer those. All right, and I see Tiffany is putting up our answers. So number one, our first question there. Lost my piece of paper here. That was the polar bears. Yes, polar bears only found in the Arctic and the largest predators on Earth. That is true. Second one, Arctic region is very desolate and has a population of less than 100,000 people. I thought this was very interesting. That's false. The Arctic is home to over 4 million people. I had no clue. I would not have guessed that at all. So that's fascinating. And let's see, have we put up our answer yet for number 3 yet? Oh, there we go. Answer number 3, Arctic is derived from the Greek word meaning bear. That is true. So how did y'all do on trivia? Hopefully that was fun. Thanks for engaging in that with us. And now, so let's see here. So we have multiple people who would like to know if Greer has been to the Arctic herself. So, and have you been?
I wish.
Yes. All right. Tell us what you would like to do if you ever had the chance to go.
Well, once I started researching sort of the specific areas that I'm writing about, they have like cruises during the summer to go up through Hudson Bay. There are, sort of small plane tours that you can take to sort of hop around and see that sort of northward area up there, up to King William's Land, where the ships were eventually found. So I would love to go up there and check it out. The farthest north I've ever been, I have been to Alaska, which actually you said was the Arctic. Okay. So I have technically been to the Arctic.
All right. I think that counts. I think we're going to say, yes, Greer McAllister has been to the Arctic.
Yes. Alaska in June is not quite the same as what these characters are undergoing, but technically I've also been to Iceland actually. So I don't remember if that was in the list of Arctic territories or not, but yeah, you can go and bundle up and enjoy those territories. But the wilds of it, it's just stunning to look at. It feels like
I could imagine.
It feels like another planet. I was actually reading today, because I now on Twitter follow a bunch of like accounts that tweet about the Arctic. And so Arctic today tweeted about they're sending astronauts to the Arctic because it's the closest experience you can have to being on the moon. So you're isolated and the world is hostile and everything around you is trying to kill you actively. And that is what it would like to be, to just be off this planet. So I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's almost like a different planet. That's a really interesting way to phrase that. I would imagine that. All right, very cool. So let's see. Next question. I've got a question here from Donna, who says she really enjoyed hearing you discuss your research process. How do you balance the use of research with fictional story choices? Do you have any personal rules regarding your fictional choices when you're writing about historical events? So tell us a little bit about the background to that.
It's a great question. I think every historical novelist sort of has their own line. I tell most of my stories are more sort of what if, like history is a jumping off point sort of thing. So I am less bound to the historical record, except for Girl in Disguise, which was about a real person, but there was so little in the historical record that you could not write a biography of Kate Warren. There's just not enough information. So a historical novel was the only way that I was going to get to introduce her to the world. And so that's what I did, which is lucky because I'm a historical novelist and not a biographer. But other than that, it's a lot of, I pull things where I can. I do composite characters if I have to, so I'm not necessarily bound to what happened to one specific person. But for me, it's all in service of the story. If I need to change the year that something happened in order to make it fit the story better, I feel like I can do that as long as an author's note covers many sins. I feel like I have to tell you, the reader, whether it was true or not. But I do that at the end. So hopefully you're swept up in the narrative and it makes sense to you as you're going along. And then you'll check and say, okay, well, this is something that Greer took directly from the historical record, Lady Jane, etc. But this character was a composite character. And then in this author's note, for example, I give the names of several of the women who inspired specific women on the expedition, so you can find out more about them.
Got it. Very cool. There's another, I just ran past a question when you mentioned, you write historical fiction, not biography, right? Someone, let's see here. There was a question for someone who wanted to know, this is Jill. She actually really likes biographies and feels like this was so close to reality. So how do you feel about these actual women that you modeled the book after? And I think also the question I would ask is, would you ever want to maybe do something nonfiction, or are you kind of firmly in your historical fiction mode?
I feel like I don't have that set of skills. Like there are some nonfiction writers that I know that do an amazing job, like Karen Abbott. Her fiction, Liar, Tempter, Soldier, Spy, the nonfiction that she writes feels novelistic. Like she can really draw you into a narrative. I like not being bound by the exact trajectory of a person's life. So I feel like I will always tend more toward the fiction side. I write nonfiction essays and things like that. I wrote about the author of The Yellow Wallpaper, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I wrote something about her life for a website. I cannot remember who it was for, but if you search my name and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, it'll probably turn up. I think it was LitHub. So I'll do things like that. I'll write little bits of things. One of the women who inspired a character in the Arctic Fury, the journalist Margaret, is inspired by Margaret Fuller, who was an amazing journalist. She was a war correspondent. She, edited a Transcendentalist journal and did really, really interesting things. So it actually led me to buy the biography of her by Megan Marshall. And so that's literally on my nightstand to read more about Margaret Fuller. And maybe that'll go somewhere into a book. But in general, if a woman's life has been covered really well in nonfiction, I tend to think, okay, that's one that I can leave alone. It's the women that not everything was written down enough for us to know her. I think those are kind of perfect for historical novels.
That is, I think that's a really great way to approach that. Very cool. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, let's see here. Oh, we've got, Andrea is asking, Greer, what is your favorite historical time period? And tell us what it is, and then have you written a story based in that time, or would you like to?
My favorite historical period. I mean, I keep writing about this 1850s to 1905 period in America, just because I keep finding fascinating stories that happened during that time. And it's funny because if I hear a story about an interesting woman, then I'm always on the lookout for, okay, where's the historical novel about this woman? So there's another source book about Emily Warren Roebling, who helped build the Brooklyn Bridge. And I was so glad when I'm like, oh yes, I need to know about her. Oh, thank goodness somebody else has written a historical novel about her. And the Wright brothers had a sister, and now there's a novel about her. So these stories are coming to the fore, which is great. So I don't think I have a specific time period. I like to read, I think, about sort of before 1900. So probably the 19th century in its entirety is my favorite.
Very cool. Very cool. So let's see. I've got a question here from Catherine, who says she really enjoys the dual timelines that you employed in the Arctic Fury and in The Magician's Lie. And she was curious to know if you find that difficult to juggle dual timelines. Do you write them simultaneously? Tell us a little bit about your process for that.
My process is a mess. I write things.
We love to hear that kind of
order. You guys get the cleaned up version. It's so much better that way. But yeah, I write all out of order. I write, I probably write the beginning, and then maybe a third of the way through, I'll write the end. And then I get the squishy middle all, sort of put away. And the funny thing was that, the Magician's Lie goes back and forth between a past and a present, which isn't our present. It's 1905. But it goes back and forth between those two. The Arctic Fury goes back and forth between two time periods and like a half. It's like 2.5 timelines, and it has 13 points of view. And it was easier to write than The Magician's Lie, which is sort of crazy. And I still kind of can't believe that my editor let me get away with it. So thank you, Shayna, for not tossing me out of the office when I said, I think I want to write this book in 13 points of view, because I want every woman on the expedition to sort of have her turn, to have her opportunity to speak. And that was new for me. Like you said earlier, Rebecca, all of my other novels have sort of had a viewpoint and followed it. The Magician's Lie sort of had too, but it was mostly Arden. But the Arctic Fury really does. It's more than half Virginia, but there's a chapter from Irene, there's a chapter from Caprice, there's a chapter from Anne. Everybody gets the opportunity to say their piece. And so for the sake of the reader, I did it in third person instead of first person.
Okay.
So it's not, I did this. It's not Virginia saying I did this and then Caprice saying I did this. It's Virginia did this and Caprice did this. So you have at least some chance of following who's doing what at any given time. And then my editor also had the smart idea of putting the list in the front of the book so that you can sort of check back and try to remember, okay, who was it that did this, and what was Irene's deal, and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's sort of the process.
Very cool. Very cool. So looking through the questions, I see several people would like to hear you talk about the cannibalism in the book. There's a couple of different questions. I was going to try and like glom them into one question, but I think maybe we'll bring that up and let you talk about it. There's someone asking about, parallels to the Donner Party, yes, parallels to, how gross was that to write it? So I'm just going to let you sort of riff on cannibalism for me.
Yeah. So my Goodreads reviews that mention cannibalism, some people think there's not enough. Some people there's too much. You literally cannot make everyone happy. And so I do not try. So I am sorry if there was not enough cannibalism for some of you out in the crowd. But I felt like if you're going to talk about the Arctic, you have to talk about the fact that you had a really good chance of running out of food. And you had to look at your options. And by the way, I have a recommendation, and you probably already know this if you're, a fan of cannibalism. But if you want more of that, The Terror, both the TV show and the novel, both about the actual Franklin expedition, if you want more gore and sort of more of a horror take on a trip to the Arctic, that is your book.
Okay.
Definitely that is more down that line. But yeah, but I felt like if you're gonna talk about being out in the wild and making tough decisions, I mean, I feel like all of my books, I try to have the stakes as high as possible and have it be life and death, and have you sort of alongside these characters as they're making really tough decisions that most of us, thank goodness, are never in the position to have to make. But I feel like, okay, it takes us to a place where we wonder what we would have done in this position if you're in the Arctic, or if you were on the Donner Party, or things like that. So I definitely I was conscious of it. I calibrated it. It was not something I wanted to like super dive into enthusiastically, but it had to be part of it.
Got it. I can imagine that researching that is probably not very fun either. So don't want to look up too much about that. All right. So we have other questions. I don't want to give too many spoilers. I know everybody should have read the book because this is a book discussion session, but every time we've done these before and we give away spoilers, people get a little antsy. So I'm going to try and not give away too many things. But we do have, let's see here. I've got several people who have asked a similar question. So we'll take this one. Each of your female characters embodies particular character traits. So was there a character that you most identified with, or was there a character that you enjoyed writing the most? Can you talk to us a little bit about these characters?
Yes, definitely both of those. So I liked writing Caprice. I like writing people who just say whatever they want because that's not me. I tell people I don't write memoir because I'm very boring. So you would not want to read about my life in any way, shape, or form. You would fall asleep. But in fiction, I can inhabit all of these different personalities and I can bring all of these people together. And so I can write somebody like Caprice who is just so privileged that she can basically say whatever she wants, and so she does, and that is fun
I
as
bet.
an
I
author to write. So I had a real soft spot for Caprice. Also, I knew from the beginning that she wasn't coming back, so that sort of freed me up to
Sure.
do that. So writing the first scene where Virginia and Caprice just rub each other the wrong way immediately it was probably the scene in the book that I rewrote the most times, but I felt like it was also the most important scene to establish that connection. So people have asked me if I were on the expedition, who would I be? The answer is that I would not be on the expedition because nobody would invite me.
You'd be back in your nice warm hotel room somewhere.
Exactly, because again, boring. But if there is a character on the expedition that I am most like, it's Margaret, because Margaret is the writer. Margaret is observing. Margaret is, keeping an eye on everybody else and sort of recording what they're doing. And she's concerned about posterity and the record and making sure that things are recorded. So definitely, she's my closest analog on the journey.
Got it. Very cool. Very cool. All right. We have a couple of other questions that are also very similar that I'll try to weave together. Kim and Julia say they enjoy the way that you weave mystery into your books. And so they'd like to know, do you consider your book to be historical mystery, or is it historical fiction first that happens to have a mystery in it? Lay out for us how that sort of happens when you're writing.
If you like historical mystery, it's a historical mystery. Genre is tricky because it means something different to different people. And so I try not to label it too much, but I think it does fit into several different categories. Certainly it's historical fiction because it takes place in the past. Historical thriller is how it sometimes gets categorized on sites. And I think that's totally fine. Historical thriller, historical mystery, because there is definitely a mystery to it. I saw somewhere it got categorized as horror, and I'm like, no, if I were a horror reader and I read it, I would be super disappointed.
Sure.
Because that has a very specific meaning. And I didn't intend for it to be that kind of book. So I always do like to have a mystery because I like to read, I like the books that I read to have mysteries. And so I definitely wanted something to pull you along. And that's why it's structured in that way too, of here's the murder trial, and then it goes back and forth between the murder trial and the expedition, so that I'm giving you pieces of information that you need in order to figure things out at the right time within the story. And sometimes people guess things and sometimes they don't, and it's a different experience for every reader. But if you find it mysterious, then I am happy.
Then it's a historical mystery. All right. I love it. And that's a really good point. I think sometimes as library folks, we try to be very aware of that what we call a mystery, somebody else would be like, oh no, there's not a detective in that. To me, that's what a mystery is. So this is just, it's a thriller or whatever. And so we always, I know, especially those of us in the library world that are into readers advisory and suggesting books, we really try and make sure to not pigeonhole things, because, handing someone the Arctic Fury and saying, oh, it's a historical mystery, they could be like, oh, I don't like mysteries. And so we do try and balance that out when we're talking about it. So I think that's really cool that you put that in it, but it's not the focus. The characters here and their stories are really what the focus is, and they happen to be a little mysterious.
Somebody might call it literary fiction.
Right,
I mean,
right,
genre.
right.
So it could be anything. Don't give it to your horror patrons. Don't give it to your romance patrons.
Right.
It would be very unsatisfying for both of those.
Not what they want. Not what they want. All right. So here's a question. It might take you a second to sort of collect what you want to think about, but you also might know this off the top of your head. I have a feeling. We have Marianne asking, what book would be the best one to read, nonfiction, about one of these actual expositions? She has seen several lists on Amazon, doesn't know what to choose. So what could we suggest to someone? And this is really great for Reader's Advisory. Someone comes in and says, oh, I really loved The Arctic Fury. I would love to know more about the real stories similar to that. So do you have any favorites that I know I'm asking this off the top of your head like that, but do you have some you could shoot along to us?
I can definitely give you one, although I cannot remember the author, but I'm sure somebody can look up. Ice Ghosts. I think it's Paul somebody. So he has the whole he has the whole perspective. It was written fairly recently, so he writes about the expedition, and he writes about the search for the ships, which I thought was really, really great. If you want to read specifically about Lady Franklin, this one, Ken McGugan, Lady Franklin's Revenge, and he also wrote one about the expedition and about John Ray. This guy who was the one who came back from the Arctic a few years after Franklin. And he was the one who found Paul Watson. Thank you, Donna. Paul Watson is Ice Ghosts. Lady Franklin's Revenge is Ken McGugan. And then John Ray was the one who came back with the evidence of cannibalism that, of course, Lady Franklin and Charles Dickens and a whole bunch of other people were like, no, that never happened. Pay no attention to those gnawed bones. Or the stories that, that the native peoples tell about what they found there. And the whole irony of the long search for the ships, of course, and Paul gets into this in Ice Ghosts, is that if they had just listened to the Inuit stories about where the ships were last seen, then they would have found the ships a lot faster. But there was not a lot of cooperation there in the earlier years, and it was only more recently that the help was extended and provided, and the ships were finally found.
Very cool. Very cool. Those would make great companion books to this. Yes. So I know people will appreciate having heard about that. So we have several questions of a personal nature for you, wanting to know a little bit more about your writing process and your life as a writer. So I've got Giselle here has said, that you wrote a post for Writer Unboxed a while back about what it means to be a writer, that you don't have to be a starving artist to be a writer, and she loved that. So she would like to know, are you still working full-time in addition to your writing? And if so, how do you balance all of that work, writing, managing your time? I know you and I were chatting a little bit beforehand that you've got elementary age kids. I do too. That takes up a lot of time. Tell us a little bit about your personal writing process and how you fit that all in life.
Yes, balance. Some days better than others. That is definitely the case. So I am still full-time employed, and that is a choice. So I think that, different people prefer different ways of working. I really like having a day job so that I don't feel pressure to produce my novels faster. Because if I were completely dependent on that income, I think it would change the way I look at the writing. But it does make me slower. I definitely, because I have commitments to the day job, because I have commitments to the family, it makes me a slower writer. So it's a lot of evenings, weekends, vacation time. Every once in a while I try to there's something called 5 a.m. Writers Club on Twitter. And every once in a while I actually wake up at 5 a.m. and write, but I tend to be more of a stay up late, right between 10 and 12 p.m. Kind of person. So 10 to 11:59 p.m. and 12 a.m. I try to go to bed at midnight. But yeah, and it's before the pandemic is its own.
Right. That's messed everything up for sure.
That, Right. Before that, I was always trying to grab moments. And so I would write, I would edit a chapter sitting in the front seat of my car in the Trader Joe's parking garage. Like I just learned to grab moments where I could. And if I only had 10 minutes, I did 10 minutes worth of work. So there's definitely, and I don't remember if I put this in the Writer Unboxed post or not, but I think there's a lot of romanticizing of what writers do. And, you have your Garrett and you have your warm steaming cup of tea, and that's great if you have a Garrett and a warm steaming cup of tea. But if you don't, you can, like, my closet's big enough to write in. I go and I sit on the floor of my closet and I write. Nobody can find me. So I do what I can in the time that I have. And my trick for getting into the writing mind space quickly is I have a theme song for every book. So I play for the Arctic
Cool.
Fury, it was, and it's not from the period or anything. For the Arctic Fury, it was Steady as She Goes by the Raconteurs. And so I would sit down and I would play that song and then start writing. And it was almost Pavlovian that it sort of signals to my brain, okay, writing time, get into it, because I didn't have time to sort of work my way into it. I had to just do it.
That is super cool. Oh, I love tidbits like that. That's really cool. Very cool. All right, so we have just a couple minutes left. So there's all these questions coming in fast and furious.
We're not going to get them all. I'm so sorry.
I know, right? We won't be able to get them all, and I've tried to pull out ones that I could combine together as well, because everybody wants to know kind of this stuff. Let's see here. Speaking of the writing process continuing, do you outline your books? Someone's got a question about that. And you have mentioned revisions. They'd like to know what you find the most challenging the most challenging part of writing to be.
All of it has its own tests. I love writing the sloppy first draft because I don't judge any of it. I fondly call it first draft trash, and I just write it and I don't judge it. And that way my word count gets up really high and I feel good about it. But then I go back with a completely, as unbiased as I can get an unbiased eye. And I throw out a lot of that writing, or I revise a lot of that writing away during the process. So that was harder when I was earlier in the writing process, before I had this many books under my belt. But now at this point, I'm just like, I learn something from every page I write, even if it's not a page that any word appears in a finished book. I've learned it. I've gotten to where I need to be by writing that. And I do outline, and then I write about half the book, and then I almost always end up throwing out the outline, because I get away with it. I get away from it as I'm writing. So for those of you who've read Woman 99, I write a synopsis when I'm selling the book to the publisher and saying, hey, this is the book that I want to write. Is it okay? There's a character named Martha in Woman 99 who didn't even appear in the synopsis. She was not even in my head at the time that I started writing that book. And she is such an important character in that book. So it was, she sort of came up during the process, and I had to give over a large part of the book to her because that was just the book that I needed to write. And I didn't know that when I started writing it.
That is really cool. I think people really like that kind of insight that, like the characters almost, they tell you what they want you to write about them, don't they? I mean, it feels kind of funny to talk about them in such concrete terms, but I've heard that from authors before, that they're like, no, I had this character on my outline, gonna be a side character, and they came into my head and said, this is what you have to say, this is my story. And it sounds like that's similar for you. So that's very cool. That's always a fun insight into the writer's mind, which we always love. So real quick, we've just only got about 2 minutes left, but we've got lots of questions that came through that want to know if you can tell us, what are you working on now? I know this just came out last month, but of course we want you to keep producing for us. So what's your next book? Have you started it? Have you thought of it? What would you like to do? Tell us a little bit.
It's a wild departure. So my last 4 books have all been historical fiction, women-led. You sort of know what you're getting with the Greer McAllister book. My next book comes out in 2022. Okay. It is the first in a series of epic fantasy. So it's And it's full of strong women because it's actually set in a matriarchal world. So sort of feminist Game of Thrones, like if you like fantasy, but there are certain things about fantasy that you don't like. This is the book that I sort of didn't see in the world that I wanted to see, and so I wrote it. So
I love it.
deep into that series. You've got about a year to wait for it, but it's called The Five Queendoms. You can find out more at my website. It's on Goodreads if you want to mark it as to read on Goodreads. And there will be much more coming about that. Also on my social media, I love to have people following me on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that. So I encourage you all. I know you had so many more questions to ask. Find me there, and we'll connect.
That's awesome. Yay. Well, Greer, it has been so fun to chat with you tonight. Thank you for spending your evening with us. I did want to let everyone know also, thank you all for submitting your questions and chatting with us. I'm sorry, we never can get to all of them. We do our best to kind of read them and talk at the same time. So your forgiveness if you have not had your question answered, but we appreciate you participating. And so speaking of all that participation, the Sourcebooks folks shortly are going to list winners' names in the chat here to check and see if you have won one of the mystery book bundles. And when they do so, if your name is listed, you just need to email Tiffany at Sourcebooks so that she can send you her prize. She will put her email address there in the chat box as well. So again, Greer, thank you for spending your evening with us. I know that everyone participating was as excited to hear about your book and your process as I was. Big thank you to all of you for participating tonight with us. Do make sure that you join us for the next Murder at the Library event. That one is going to be Wednesday, February 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And I will be talking with the author of the Tully Jadsel murder mystery series, Joseph Schneider. So Dick Wolf, the creator of Law and Order, has called the series brilliant and says that Schneider's writing evokes some of Hollywood's most classic crime stories, from Chinatown to LA Confidential. So that's a real mystery if you're a mystery fan. So if you're a detective or police procedural fan, you won't want to miss that one. So again, that is going to be Wednesday, February 24th at 7 o'clock Eastern. We will be discussing the first two books in that series, One Day You'll Burn and What Waits for You. We will have the registration information there in the chat that will come up as well. And if you want to go ahead and register for that, you'll be all set. Otherwise, one more big thank you to Greer. Thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed talking about not only this book, but your previous books and your upcoming one, which I know everyone's going to be excited about. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks to everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone.